Hi, my friends. It is so good to see you all. It's been a while. I am Dr. Sue Varma, and I am so excited to be talking to you all. Hello to our friends from all over the globe who have been taking time out of their schedule to have a very important conversation about your mental health today, and not just your mental health, but about collective trauma, which we're seeing a lot of, and then how can we use self-compassion as a way to deal with it. So I'm so glad. Drop in your comments where you're from. I know that we have a very international crowd, and I'm very excited. I know we have people from all time zones, from all over the world. I'm in the United States on the East Coast. So quick introduction about myself before we jump in. I'm a board certified psychiatrist, a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at NYU Langone, a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, and in my practice, a cognitive behavioral therapist and a couples counselor. One of the hats that I wore when I first started my career was working with survivors of trauma at the World Trade Center Mental Health Program. So I have some experience dealing with resilience and how do we come out of sort of mass disasters. So wonderful to see you all. I see people from India, from Honduras, from Iraq. So thank you. Thank you for all making time out of your important and very busy schedules today. You might remember me from some of the talks that I joined you guys here before during the summer. How much has changed, right? Like we have a vaccine since the last time I spoke to you guys. I was first a guest here with Dr. Drew Ramsey. We were talking about frontline health workers and talking about their mental health. And subsequently, I gave talks here on Medscape for high functioning anxiety, high functioning depression, and optimism. So this is my 5th talk, and you can see some of the talks here on Medscape. And you can also follow me on @Dr. Sue Varma on Instagram, where I'm giving a lot of mental health information. One of the hats that I wear is a media contributor for the last 15 years, and I'm talking about mental health through a variety of different disasters, if you will, including the pandemic. I've been talking a lot during this time and seeing patients and working with frontline workers. So first of all, hats off to everybody here who's in the healthcare profession, or even those who really care about health and are a fan of Medscape, as I am. I get a lot of great nuggets of information and wisdom from this channel. So I want to talk to you a little bit about collective trauma, right? So we all have an understanding of what trauma is, and there is a DSM definition of what trauma is, which is, textbook, but I really like to think beyond the textbook, right? Like I'm a clinician. Yes, I am an educator too, but I think that we need to use real life experience, and we need to be able to expand our definition and conceptualization of what trauma is. I think of trauma really as something that breaches our ability to cope. So even though textbook definitions of trauma, or specifically post-traumatic stress disorder, talk about a syndrome of hypervigilance, feeling hyperarousal, startle reactions, having fear, insomnia, numbness, avoidance, depression, sometimes substance abuse, sometimes domestic violence, but it talks about this in the context of life-threatening events that we have either personally experienced or that we have witnessed. So sure, let's think of that as trauma with a capital T, but then let's think of trauma with a little t, right? So all the losses that we are experiencing on a daily basis, right? The things that we didn't get to have, the graduations, the ceremonies, the funerals, the memorials, the rites of passage, the weddings that had to be put off. So when I think of this broader definition, it's not just bad things that have happened to us, it's also the good things that we didn't get to have. So if that's a definition of trauma as a whole of loss, right, of grieving, of loss of life, loss of limb, witnessing somebody, and usually we're talking about an individual though when we talk about trauma for the most part, right? So if something happened, if you were, God forbid, involved in a burglary or a car accident, we're having more mass shootings in the United States in the last several weeks, and this has been a constant, but there's a feeling of the individual was involved. But what we're recognizing is that there's also this concept of stress contagion. So after 9/11, we saw that people who might have been living in other parts of the country might have had a heightened sense of fear or threat simply through watching media. So we need to keep an eye on the role of media on our mental health. And there's nothing wrong in being plugged in, right? We want to be plugged in, but at the same time, we want to be able to give our brain a break from all of the information. We know that increased media consumption for individuals, especially children, can be problematic and increase a lot of people's anxiety and depression and insomnia. And this is already a situation in which we are experiencing 60 to 80% of people, in fact, are having more anxiety, more depression, and insomnia worldwide. So that brings me to my this idea. Not my idea, I did not invent this idea, I'd like to take credit for it, but this idea of collective trauma, which is no longer on the individual level, it is on a mass scale. And there is nothing more mass scale, nothing more global than a global pandemic. And when people are traveling now, or will start to travel, they will encounter people from all parts of the world, and all you have to say is COVID-19, and everybody has a general sense of what you mean. And this is probably not going to be the case if you said, oh, I was in a car accident, and maybe somebody hasn't or has not necessarily experienced what you went through. So there is a collective sharing of a common experience in collective trauma when you have a mass disaster, when you have a natural disaster, when you have a shooting, when you have war, when there's genocide. So in a variety of cases, people will be experiencing the same thing at the same time. But there's a huge caveat. We're never really experiencing the same thing at the same time. Why? Because we're individuals and we have our own experiences, our own lenses, our own traumas with a capital T or with a small t before coming into this. Whether it be heightened trauma as a society that we have already experienced, if there's a group of individuals have already been discriminated or victims of bias or felt marginalized to begin with, these folks are going to experience more trauma during these mass events. If you have an individual or personal psychiatric illness, you're going to be more at risk if you have a family history of psychiatric illness. So it's very important to keep in mind that while we're talking about collective trauma and there is this shared experience component of it, there's also a very much an individual experience of this. And so it's not exactly the same. You might be able to understand, and that's the beauty of it, is that the silver lining in all of this is that we're going through it together, but at the same time, every person's experience is going to be different. And why is it that I'm making this distinction? Because collective trauma can, on one level, make a person feel less alienated when they're sharing or comparing war stories, so to speak, because on some level we can all understand, we're all going through the same thing. And at the same time, another person might feel, how is it that I can talk about? Why do I have room to talk about what I'm going through? Why should I? I didn't experience it as bad as the next person. I don't get it. So we tend to minimize our own experiences sometimes in a collective trauma situation because we think we didn't have it as bad. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe we thought we had it way worse and we're comparing ourselves to other people. So comparisons, minimization, and then finally, this idea of toxic positivity in collective trauma of we just need to be positive and move on, which is, look, I'm all for positivity, 100%. If you listen to my talk on practical optimism, which is here archived in the Instagram, IGTV, you'll hear that I'm very much into optimism and positivity 100% and the role of positive psychiatry and prevention. At the same time, I don't want it to be toxic where we're telling people to just deal with it because you know what, you're no different. We've all gone through the same experience, right? So we want to be very careful. So that's where compassion enters as a form, self-compassion, as a way to combat the collective trauma. So we've talked about collective trauma as an experience that we're all grieving and sharing together. And at the same time, we want to be careful that we also understand and promote and encourage the individual to be able to get the help that they need, to be able to get the attention that they need, to be able to take up space, even in an interpersonal conversation, even in a social situation with somebody that you trust. That's key, that you pick the right person to talk to, whether it be a provider, a healthcare provider, or even a friend. And self-compassion is going to allow you that, because the way that I think of self-compassion, it is not indulgent. It is not the same thing as self-care, though self-care might be one subset under self-compassion. When I think of self-compassion, I think of an overarching umbrella, an overarching philosophy of kindness directed towards the self, forgiveness, acceptance, awareness, a non-judgmental quality of looking at yourself, looking at your needs, and being able to ask for them. And now, if we're talking about collective trauma, we want to be able to recognize and have compassion for other people who are in our group and say that as a community, how do we rebuild? So first of all, there has to be respect and understanding of mental health issues. And as somebody who has worked with trauma survivors over the last 15 to 20 years, I can tell you that it is so crucial that we pay attention to both logistical, concrete things that people need to rebuild. So anytime you have let's say a hurricane or a tsunami, there's infrastructure that needs to be built, right? So people have been displaced out of their homes. So some things very simple as food, water, clean water, access to these things, right? A safe place to live, shelter, basic medical needs. These are all going to be some really important things that we're going to need. We're going to need to have infrastructure and safety and shelter and food and water. So that's the basic. And that brings me to my next point of self-compassion. What does it actually look like, right? What are some of the components tangibly, concretely? So I'm not talking in the clouds like, woo woo, let's talk about like self-compassion. Let's all hug and, hold hands. And that's the other thing, is that the hugging component, because of the global pandemic, we're all concerned. Do we shake hands with people afterwards? Do we hug them? Are we not allowed? The social isolation. And there's going to be re-entry anxiety, right? Like, what am I allowed to do? Are we forever going to be in fear of one another, of fear of being in close contact? And it's going to be interesting to see that how do we move forward as a society? Because hugging and close contact and social support is such a huge part of recovery from trauma. And we haven't been able to have that, right? To be able to get together and to commemorate any mass disaster, people are allowed to hug and hold hands. And here we have to be cautious of that because of the very nature of what we're dealing with is a virus. So I wanted to give you a 5 sort of step, and they're in no particular order, but I call them the 5 priorities of collective trauma, of self-compassion to combat collective trauma. And these are sort of evidence-based in terms of what do we do after trauma. And one of the things we know we shouldn't do or we don't need to do is this idea of debriefing, which is forcing people to open up and talk about their trauma before they're ready, and that can be sometimes damaging. So in due time, we want to provide mental health services to people, deliver them to them in their communities, speaking their language, appreciating their culture, and making it available and accessible, reducing barriers to treatment. So that's a huge part of getting over collective trauma. And even if it's in the form of group therapy, because if that's maybe all that can be offered, then take it, culturally sensitive and appropriate. But if I could give you sort of 5 things, 5 steps, I want to say that these are the 5 key things for either self-compassion or compassion in a community in order to combat collective trauma. It's being able to create a sense of safety, and I just mentioned what that's about in terms of like food, shelter, knowing that you're not going to be re-exposed to the source of harm. And this isn't just about the pandemic. Think in terms of all sort of disasters or massive, large-scale events that we've been contending with. So safety is a big, big part of this, right? And on a daily level, safety might even literally be having a routine in your life. And that sounds so funny, but when you have predictability, when you have certainty, you feel grounded, right? You feel secure. So we could take it on a large level of food, shelter, water, and we could take it on a small individual personal level to say, I just want to know what I'm doing for the next 24 hours. And can I possibly repeat the same schedule for the next week? I want to know, I want to feel safe. I want to exert control over the things that I can have control over. The second one is self-efficacy, which is giving a person a sense of, I can do this, I got this. And it's not just your ability to do something that predicts how well you do it. It's not your actual ability, believe it or not. It is your prediction, your perception, which is what self-efficacy is about, a sense of proficiency on whether or not you can do it. And if you have the self-efficacy, whatever it is, whether it's working out, whether it's weight loss, you're more likely inclined to take on a task. Number one, if you think you can do it, you're going to sign up for the task. You're not going to avoid it. You're not going to procrastinate. So let's say it's weight loss. Let's say it's going, for a run now that the weather is better in many parts of the world. you might say, if I know that I can do it, so you're going to sign up for it, whatever it might be, a running club or just you buying shoes and getting out there. Then if you encounter obstacles, you're more likely to persevere and persist in the face of them if you have a sense of self-efficacy. So it builds confidence, it builds persistence, it decreases avoidance and procrastination. The other one is hope. So if I'm giving you 5 things that you want to take from this conversation, right? These 5 tips. Safety, what does that mean in your daily life? Could that be as simple as getting food and water and predictability and clean and sort of safe and healthy? The second thing is self-efficacy. How can you build this? One of the best ways to build self-efficacy is through doing things yourself. So we build self-efficacy when we watch other people do things, role models, people that we look up to, people that we trust. But we also build self-efficacy when we do things ourselves and then when we're successful at them. The third thing is hope. Building hope is by looking at what are some of the positive things in the future that I look forward to. And hope can be built by different people in different ways. It can be reframing your situation. What's the best thing that can happen to me? Asking yourself what's the worst and what's the most likely. As I mentioned to you, I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, so I do a lot of reframing, cognitive restructuring, looking at people's distortions. And I don't mean to minimize or say this is in your head, because clearly we know that there's a lot of factors at play and they're not in our head, right? If we're talking about, nowadays we're talking more and more about sort of institutional and systemic biases, right? So this is not in your head. And me, what I call myself is a practical optimist, and it's something that I'm thinking and writing about these days. It focuses on both aspects of what can I change in the world and then what can I change in my thinking, in both, so that I can be the most productive that I can be, right? So that's what I want to say about hope. The next thing is about calm. What makes us feel calm? For me, this is, as a psychiatrist, emotional regulation. You can meditate, you can journal, you can vent to a friend. If you're venting, the most productive venting sessions are, I'd say, about 15 minutes long, but you get it out there, and then you also discuss the positive and acknowledge and experience gratitude. And of course, for some people who are experiencing trauma, they're going to need to be in behavioral health treatment. They're going to need to be on medication. So don't be afraid of that. Self-compassion gives you permission to ask for the help that you need, whether it be mental health treatment, whether it be a day off, whether it be asking for more support at work. Months ago in the beginning of pandemic, it was being able to ask for PPE. We know that frontline workers are going to be more at risk for a lot of the trauma because they saw things that they are never going to unsee, that they were feeling, at risk, at heightened threat. They have gotten sick. They have had family members get sick. They've had patients die on them. And we've had family members get sick. Family members have passed. So, there's all these layers that are going to predict the level of stress and trauma, whether financial losses, did you get furloughed, what happened? The more disasters that happened, you can just add on, stack it on. And if you have a history of psychiatric issues or a history of trauma in your community to begin with, this is all going to be far worse. And the fifth thing is connectedness. And this is huge, the role of social support in combating stress. This is a huge part of our resilience as human beings, is our connectedness with other people. So like I said, in summary, safety, self-efficacy, hope, calming, and connectedness. So these are sort of the 5 priorities I want you to think of when you build your self-compassion practice. And it really is a practice because for some people it comes a lot easier. The idea is that some people can be very self-compassionate, they can be forgiving, they can be accepting, they can be non-judgmental. And I just want to be very clear that self-compassion doesn't mean that you give yourself a pass to do whatever you want to do to anybody you want to do. Not at all. Self-compassion involves reflection, insight, good judgment, wisdom, and responsibility taking. So we have a sense of who we are in the world, what we do to other people, and how we want to carry ourselves. So there's integrity involved in self-compassion. So this is not at all a free pass or being self-indulgent. It really is looking at your core values and seeing whether your life right now is reflecting that. How are you talking to yourself? Are you talking to yourself in a kind way, the way you would talk to somebody else? Or are you berating yourself for any limitations that you're experiencing? So if there's one thing that you take away from this, is that we as a society have been through so much in the last 14 months. And when I was reading studies about post-traumatic stress disorder after pandemics, we were talking about people who are having symptoms after 12 to 14 days. And here we are 12 to 14 months later. So you guys are all incredibly resilient no matter what you've been through. I know if you're listening to this, you're probably doing a little okay, I hope. And if you're not, please talk to somebody and have a listen to some of the other talks of a lot of the great experts who are here on Medscape in the IGTV. And please feel free to connect with me on at Dr. Sue Varma on Instagram. I hope that you all stay well, and I look forward to our next talk together. Be well. Thank you for joining me today.